The morning of March 3rd, 1943, broke with deceptive stillness across the Bismarck Sea. Captain Sato Yasuo stood on the bridge of destroyer Asashio, his weathered hands gripping the rail as he surveyed the 8 transport vessels his flotilla was sworn to protect. Behind him, the volcanic peaks of New Britain faded into morning mist. Ahead lay 80 miles of crystalline water, then survival for the garrison that waited there, desperate for the 6,900 soldiers packed into the holds below his feet. The veteran destroyer captain had sailed these waters through 2 years of Pacific warfare. He knew the weight of escort duty, the mathematics of sacrifice, the cold truth that his ship existed to die so others might live. But on this morning, as tropical sun burned through the overcast, Sato felt something he had not experienced in years of combat, a crawling unease that settled in his gut like lead. The convoy's protective diamond formation stretched across the water in textbook precision. 8 destroyers, battle-hardened veterans of Guadalcanal, each one positioning itself as a steel shield around the vulnerable merchant vessels. Their anti-aircraft guns bristled toward empty sky. Their crews stood ready at battle stations, eyes scanning horizons for the high-altitude bombers they had learned to expect and evade. What they did not know, what they could not know, was that the rules of naval warfare were about to be rewritten in blood and fire. Within minutes, bombers would appear at wave height, spitting torrents of machine gun fire that would sweep their decks clean of men. Bombs would skip across water like thrown stones, detonating below waterlines where armor was weakest. The 15 minutes that followed would shatter Japanese confidence in convoy operations and prove that innovation, married to desperation, could transform the balance of an entire war. The horizon remained empty, the sea calm. Sato checked his watch. 900 hours. Right on schedule. In less than 60 minutes, his world would end. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. By late 1942, the Pacific Ocean had become a chessboard of desperation stretched across 6,000 miles of contested water. Japan's empire, which had seemed invincible just months earlier, now found itself bleeding from 1,000 cuts. Each island fortress, each jungle garrison, required constant resupply. Without convoys bringing ammunition, medicine, and reinforcements, the entire defensive perimeter would collapse like a house built on sand. For the Allies, the situation remained equally dire. General Douglas MacArthur's forces clung to footholds in New Guinea with fingernail tenacity. Australia, exposed and vulnerable, waited for the next Japanese thrust southward. The race was simple. Whichever side could maintain its supply lines would survive. Whichever side lost control of the sea lanes would starve. The tactical problem that haunted Allied commanders was equally simple to state and seemingly impossible to solve. High-altitude bombing, the proud doctrine of the Army Air Forces, had proven catastrophically ineffective against moving ships. From 20,000 feet, bombs fell like leaves, easily avoided by vessels turning at 20 knots. A ship could move hundreds of feet in the seconds it took ordnance to fall from bombing altitude. What appeared to be perfect aim became nothing more than spray in empty ocean. The mathematics of aerial warfare mocked the courage of crews who risked their lives only to watch targets sail away untouched. Meanwhile, Japanese naval doctrine placed absolute faith in the concept of the decisive battle. This strategy, rooted in Admiral Mahan's theories and adapted into Japanese thinking, assumed that well-escorted convoys brought into climactic engagement would guarantee victory. Destroyers circled transports with overlapping fields of fire. Anti-aircraft batteries drilled endlessly to repel high-flying intruders. To Japanese commanders, air power represented an annoyance, not a death sentence. Their ships had survived Guadalcanal, Midway, countless engagements in contested waters. They believed steel and discipline would prevail. They were about to learn how catastrophically wrong they were. The jungles of New Guinea could not be taken or held without supplies. Every sack of rice, every crate of ammunition, every soldier crossing the Bismarck Sea represented the lifeblood of Japan's campaign. To cut those arteries was to bleed the empire dry. The question was how to accomplish what conventional bombing had failed to achieve. In early 1943, whispers of innovation began stirring at dusty airstrips scattered across northern Australia. Mechanics and pilots, driven by frustration and necessity, dared to imagine a different kind of aerial warfare. If bombs from above could not hit their targets, perhaps bombs delivered at sea level could succeed. If defensive armament proved too light to suppress enemy fire, perhaps a bomber's nose could bristle with machine guns like a flying gunship. These ideas were radical, even dangerous, but desperation demanded experimentation. The cost of failure was measured in islands lost and soldiers dead. The Japanese, however, remained blind to these developments. Their intelligence spoke of clumsy American tactics and wasted missions. Their captains grew confident, convinced no aircraft could pierce the shield of destroyers and disciplined formations. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, standing aboard destroyer Shirayuki as his convoy prepared to depart Rabaul, embodied that faith. He believed his 8 destroyers could protect anything. He believed the convoy steaming toward Leh was secure. He believed his 6,900 soldiers would reach their repulse destination and turn the tide of battle in New Guinea. What he could not see was the silent revolution taking place beyond the horizon. Innovation was reshaping the very nature of naval warfare. The rules of the ocean, once dictated by battleships and torpedoes, were about to be rewritten by medium bombers flying at the edge of the waves. Soon, the Bismarck Sea would bear witness to the collapse of an old doctrine and the birth of a terrible new one. In the sweltering heat of Townsville, Australia, a man named Paul Gunn stood before a battered B-25 Mitchell, his eyes seeing not what the aircraft was, but what it could become. Gunn was no ordinary officer. A former Navy pilot, born in Arkansas and raised in the Philippines, he had watched his family vanish into Japanese internment camps after Pearl Harbor. What remained was a man consumed by a single purpose: revenge sharpened into genius. The B-25 Mitchell had been designed as a medium bomber, a workhorse meant for altitude runs and level bombing. Its nose featured a glass dome where a bombardier crouched, peering through the famous Norden bomb site, waiting to release strings of explosives from thousands of feet above. But against ships, this doctrine was worse than useless. It was suicide dressed in procedure. Gunn imagined something different. He envisioned tearing away that fragile glass, replacing it with steel, mounting machine guns in the nose. Not 2 guns, not 4. 8 50 caliber machine guns, each one spitting nearly 800 rounds per minute. Each bullet a 4-ounce slug of steel and lead, 8 together creating a torrent of death, over 6,000 rounds per minute, more firepower than some destroyers could unleash. The B-25 would no longer glide above battle. It would charge like an enraged bull, breathing fire from its nose, shredding enemy decks in storms of tracer fire. Working with Jack Fox, a North American aviation representative, Gunn turned imagination into metal in dusty workshops across Australia. Mechanics stripped away bombardier stations, bolted heavy mounts into fuselages, fed belts of 50 caliber ammunition into new weapons. The work was dangerous, improvised, brilliant. They salvaged guns from crashed P-39s and P-40s, fighters that had been lost during training flights. Nothing was wasted. Everything served the singular purpose of transformation. The B-25 had grown fangs. It was no longer a bomber. It was a flying destroyer. Yet firepower alone solved only half the problem. Major William Benn, commander of the 63rd Bombardment Squadron, wrestled with another challenge that haunted his dreams: accuracy. He had watched bombs fall harmlessly into ocean spray while Japanese ships danced away untouched. Traditional bombing doctrine demanded altitude. Altitude meant safety, but altitude also meant missing every single target that mattered. Ben began experimenting with an idea as ancient as skipping stones across a pond. Skip bombing. The concept was brutal in its simplicity. Fly at wave-top height, no more than 200 feet above water. Release the bomb at full speed, approximately 230 knots, Let physics do the rest. The bomb would skip, once, twice across the waves, then smash into the hull at the waterline where armor was weakest, where a single rupture could rip a ship's heart apart. It was daring, it was reckless, and it demanded nerves of steel that few men possessed. Pilots would dive to mast height, skimming at 300 miles per hour, staring down the barrels of every gun on deck. They would press forward into storms of fire, holding course until the last possible moment, releasing ordnance so close that gunners could see the pilot's eyes through windscreens. Success or death, nothing existed in between. Together, Gunn's gun nose and Ben's skip bombing technique fused into a doctrine unlike anything seen before. Crews trained relentlessly in harbours, attacking hulks until their timing became instinct. One aircraft would strafe decks first, sweeping anti-aircraft crews from their posts in fountains of blood and flame. Another would follow close behind, releasing bombs so low that the skip across water seemed to defy gravity itself. The ocean became a proving ground for a new breed of warfare, fast, close, merciless. By early 1943, field workshops had turned out dozens of these monsters. Some carried 4 guns, some 6, and a handful mounted the full 8, dorsal turrets, waist positions, cheek pods, all bristling with weapons until the B-25 seemed less an aircraft than a storm of steel wrapped in wings. The men who flew them whispered that they were riding dragons. The Japanese had no idea such creatures existed. Their intelligence reports spoke of American bombers that attacked from safe altitude. Their doctrine assumed conventional tactics. Their confidence remained unshaken. But across the Bismarck Sea, innovation had already won the battle before the first shot was fired. The transformation carried more than technical weight. For Americans still reeling from the humiliation of 1942, after bitter retreats and shattered convoys, here was proof that ingenuity could flip the balance. Mechanics who had once merely tightened bolts now stood proud, knowing their hands had reshaped history. Pilots looked at their machines with awe, as though they had been handed not just aircraft but instruments of vengeance itself. From these dusty workshops in Australia emerged a legend, the 8-gun nose B-25, the flying destroyer of the Pacific. It was born from grief, sharpened by necessity, perfected in secrecy. Soon it would roar into battle and show the world how a single idea, pursued with obsessive determination, could transform an entire war. Night draped itself over the airfields of New Guinea like a heavy curtain on March 2, 1943. While the Japanese convoy turned southward through storm and spray, another kind of storm gathered on Allied runways. Floodlights flickered across lines of B-25 Mitchells as mechanics worked until their hands bled, tightening bolts, checking gun mounts, sliding belts of 50 caliber ammunition into place. The smell of oil and cordite filled the air as bombs were rolled across tarmac and secured beneath wings. Inside wooden huts, pilots bent over crude maps spread across tables. The target was clear, a convoy of 8 transports and their escorts, bound for Lae, carrying reinforcements desperately needed by Japanese forces clinging to New Guinea. The mission, however, was unprecedented. They would not attack from the safety of altitude, where bombers traditionally operated. They would go in low, mast height, skimming the waves straight into the teeth of Japanese guns. It was a gamble. Every man in those huts knew the mathematics of survival had shifted against them. Some crews wrote final letters home that night. They folded them carefully and slipped them into pockets, unsure if anyone would ever deliver them. Others cleaned their pistols, not out of hope for survival, but because ritual gave focus in the hours before dawn. Photographs of wives, sweethearts, children lay tucked into flight jackets, pressed close to beating hearts that quickened with each passing hour. They had trained for this moment, practicing skip bombing runs until the technique felt like muscle memory. But tomorrow would not be practice. Tomorrow, the enemy would shoot back. The atmosphere was tense, almost sacred. Conversations dropped to whispers. Cigarettes glowed like faint stars in the darkness. A chaplain made his way down the line, offering words no one quite heard, words drowned by the thrum of engines idling in the distance. The men were not seeking comfort anymore. They were preparing to enter a place where chance, skill, and fate intertwined in a matter of seconds. Far out at sea, aboard the transport Kyokusei Maru, officers gathered for a sparse evening meal. They spoke of unloading schedules, of reinforcing troops at Leh, of the inevitable victory that would follow once the garrison was secure. None of them imagined disaster. Previous American attacks, high-altitude bombers dropping harmless payloads into empty ocean, had proven laughable. The destroyers surrounding them would guard the transports like steel wolves circling a flock. Of this, they were certain. As dawn neared, the storm that had cloaked the convoy for 3 days began to break apart over the Bismarck Sea. Skies cleared into crystalline blue. To Allied airmen, it was as though Providence itself had opened the curtain for their strike. Reconnaissance aircraft confirmed the convoy's position, moving steadily, less than 100 miles from its destination. The window had arrived. At first light on March 3rd, engines roared to life one by one. The Mitchells rumbled, down dirt runways, noses heavy with guns, bellies armed with bombs. Their wings vibrated as power surged through engines, straining against the sky. Dust rose in great clouds as aircraft lifted into the air, climbing into formation. Behind them, silence fell across the airfields. Silence broken only by the beating hearts of those left behind, waiting for the sound of returning planes. The crews knew what awaited them. They had studied the convoy's defences. 8 destroyers with overlapping fields of fire. Gunners drilled to repel high-altitude raids. Anti-aircraft batteries positioned to create killing zones in the sky. But what they carried was something the Japanese had never faced before. The 8-gun nose, the skip bombing technique, the brutal determination to close the distance and strike at point-blank range. It was not merely a mission. It was a test of innovation against doctrine, of desperation against confidence. Captain Sato, standing on the bridge of his destroyer as morning light spread across the sea, felt only calm. He saw no enemy, heard no engines. To him, the journey seemed assured. He had no idea that across the horizon, shadows were already racing low above the waves, closing fast, carrying with them the end of his convoy and the beginning of a new age in warfare. The road to battle was over. The battle itself was about to begin. The morning of March 3rd, 1943, at 900 hours, Captain Sato heard it first. A distant drone, faint at first, then growing, the sound of engines echoing across crystalline waters. He raised his binoculars with hands that suddenly felt cold. On the horizon, dark specks appeared, not high above, where bombers were supposed to fly, low, impossibly low, skimming the surface of the sea like predatory birds hunting prey. From his position aboard destroyer Asashio, Sato counted the approaching formation. 16 aircraft, then more behind them. His mind raced through tactical calculations, years of combat experience, screaming warnings his doctrine had never prepared him to hear. This was not the high-altitude attack his crews had trained to repel. These aircraft were coming in at mast height, closing fast at speeds that made evasive maneuvering meaningless. Rear Admiral Kimura's voice crackled urgently over radio frequencies as destroyer captains reported multiple aircraft formations converging on their position from various compass headings. The convoy commander's years of Pacific warfare told him immediately that such coordinated approach indicated extensive pre-planning rather than opportunistic encounter. Allied intelligence had been tracking them since departure from Rabaul. The realization hit like ice water. They had been hunted from the beginning. Emergency battle station alarms began wailing across all 16 vessels. Gun crews scrambled to their anti-aircraft positions. Transport captains ordered maximum speed in desperate attempts to reach the relative safety of Leh's coastal defences. But 80 miles remained. 80 miles that might as well have been 800. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The blue waters that had seemed like a highway to salvation were about to become a graveyard. The first wave struck with precision that defied belief. Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters screamed down from 8,000 feet in perfectly coordinated diving attacks that caught Japanese anti-aircraft gunners completely off guard. Twin-engine fighters, each mounting 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns, opened fire simultaneously. Devastating curtains of lead swept across destroyer Shirayuki's superstructure like a mechanical hurricane, killing dozens of sailors and obliterating most of her forward anti-aircraft positions in the first 30 seconds of combat. The Australian squadron's tactical doctrine of immediate defensive suppression was working exactly as planned. Neutralized Japanese countermeasures before the heavy bombers arrived to deliver their devastating payloads. Sato watched in horror from Asashio's bridge as sister ships began taking fire, their decks transformed into killing grounds where men fell like wheat before a scythe. Then came the Mitchells. Major Ed Lana's modified B-25 strafer led the formation, its solid nose bristling with 8 50-caliber machine guns. No glass bombardier station, no Norden bombsight. Only black barrels that suddenly erupted in streams of tracer fire connecting sky to sea in luminous arcs of death. At 500 yards, the concentrated firepower was devastating. Glass shattered, steel peeled open like paper. Men were hurled aside as if struck by invisible fists. Transport Captain Yamamoto stood frozen on Kyokusei Maru's bridge as the lead American bomber bore down on his vessel. He had never seen anything like it. The bomber was not pulling up to bombing altitude. It was diving toward them, guns blazing, closing the distance until he could see individual muzzle flashes. At 300 yards, bombs released. They fell at shallow angles, hit the water, skipped once, twice, like stones hurled by giants, then slammed into the hull below the waterline. The explosion that followed ripped through Kyokusei Maru with catastrophic force. The ship lurched violently. Fire and smoke belched from her sides. Within seconds, seawater was flooding compartments below decks, where over 1,000 soldiers waited in darkness. The screams began immediately. Men trapped in steel coffins as the ocean rushed in. Yamamoto felt the deck tilt beneath his feet. His ship, which had seemed invincible just minutes earlier, was dying. Behind Lana came 11 more Mitchells, each repeating the deadly choreography. Lieutenant Ralph Dello lined up on transport Teiyo Maru. His 8 guns opened fire at 400 yards, sweeping the decks clean. His skip bomb hit amidships, detonating deep in the engine room. Metal shrieked. Flames erupted. The transport staggered, slowed, then stopped dead in the water, hemorrhaging smoke and fire. Everywhere, destruction multiplied with mathematical precision. Transport Nojima split in half under the fury of 3 direct hits. Transport Kembumaru, loaded with drummed aviation fuel, burst into flame in a rolling tower of fire visible from 50 miles away. Explosions shook the air as bombs detonated below waterlines, rupturing boilers, tearing holes the size of houses in steel hulls. In the span of 10 minutes, ships that had seemed untouchable were reduced to burning wrecks settling into the depths. On destroyer Tokitsukaze, Lieutenant Commander Katsumi shouted orders that were lost in the storm of battle. His guns, designed for surface duels, could not track bombers screaming past at 300 miles per hour, barely 50 feet above the sea. Smaller anti-aircraft weapons traversed too slowly. Gunners froze, stunned at the sight of aircraft roaring so close they could see pilots' faces through windscreens. Then came the fire. Machine gun torrents that swept them from their posts. Bombs that skipped like predators across waves, detonating with merciless precision against hull plating never designed to withstand such concentrated assault. One desperate destroyer captain attempted the unthinkable. He ordered his ship to ram an incoming Mitchell head-on, hoping to trade his vessel for one enemy bomber. The American pilot, Lieutenant James Murphy, yanked his bomber upward at the last instant, skimming the destroyer's mast by less than 10 feet. As he passed overhead, his dorsal gunner unleashed a storm of 50-caliber rounds directly into the bridge, killing officers where they stood. The destroyer veered wildly, ablaze and crippled, its suicidal charge ending in flames rather than collision. For the Japanese sailors and soldiers caught in this maelstrom, the experience transcended battle and entered the realm of nightmare. Survivors later described the Mitchells as fire-breathing dragons rising from the sea itself, their noses spitting streams of tracer fire that connected heaven and hell. The sound was overwhelming, engines roaring, guns chattering, bombs exploding, men screaming, all colliding in a symphony of destruction that drowned thought itself. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Convoy discipline disintegrated within minutes. Transport vessels turned erratically, some colliding with one another in desperate attempts to evade the relentless aerial assault. Others slowed as boilers burst, leaving them sitting targets for follow-up attacks. From above, high-flying B-17s added their weight, dropping bombs that forced destroyers to maintain formation even as their worlds dissolved into chaos. The assault came from every direction, high, low, port, starboard, until it seemed the very sea itself was alive with predators. Destroyer Asashio, under Captain Tanaka's command, attempted to lay protective smoke screens around surviving transport vessels, but the overwhelming number of attacking aircraft made effective defensive maneuvering virtually impossible in the confined waters of Huon Gulf. Her anti-aircraft guns fired continuously at the swirling mass of Allied bombers and fighters, occasionally scoring hits that sent damaged enemy aircraft spiraling toward the sea. But for every attacking plane driven off, 2 more seemed to take its place in the relentless onslaught. By 9:15, just 15 minutes after the initial attack commenced, the tactical situation had become catastrophic. All 8 transport vessels had been hit, 6 were sinking or already gone beneath the waves. Destroyer Shirayuki was a floating furnace, her superstructure consumed by flames fed by aviation fuel from destroyed aircraft mixed with her own diesel stores. Destroyer Asashio wallowed dead in the water, her hull torn open by skip bombs that had detonated with surgical precision below her waterline. Rear Admiral Kimura's flagship destroyer had lost all communications capability. The veteran naval commander, his uniform singed and bloodied from shrapnel wounds, continued issuing tactical orders even as his bridge equipment failed, and his anti-aircraft guns fell silent one by one under the relentless strafing attacks. His years of combat experience told him the convoy was doomed, but duty demanded he fight to the last possible moment to save whatever lives remained among his scattered and burning vessels. Captain Sato, aboard Asashio, had managed to avoid the worst of the bombing attacks through desperate high-speed maneuvering that pushed his destroyer to its mechanical limits. But his crew was rapidly exhausting their anti-aircraft ammunition in futile attempts to drive off the swarms of Allied aircraft that seemed to multiply rather than diminish as the battle continued. His 25mm guns had scored several hits on attacking bombers, sending at least 2 enemy aircraft crashing into the sea. But such minor victories were meaningless against the overwhelming numerical superiority of the Allied air armada. The water around the convoy's last known position had become a hellscape. Oil slicks stretched for miles, glistening black beneath midday sun. Burning debris floated everywhere. Lifeboats, crates, bodies, all mixed together in a grotesque soup of destruction. Soldiers and sailors clung to whatever wreckage they could find. Many already dead from wounds, others dying slowly from burns or drowning in oil-slicked water thick with the smell of diesel and death. Lieutenant Commander Tanaka abandoned his sinking transport vessel as hull plates buckled and seawater rushed through massive tiers, created by skip bombing attacks that had penetrated below the waterline with devastating effectiveness. He struggled through oil-coated water thick with floating debris, and the bodies of soldiers who had been killed instantly by machine gun fire or explosive detonations. His rescue attempts were hampered by continuing aerial assault that showed no signs of diminishing in intensity. Enemy fighters continued strafing the water to prevent organized rescue efforts, turning the traditional mercy of the sea into another killing ground for Japanese survivors. The systematic destruction reached its crescendo as high-altitude B-25s released their bomb loads with mathematical precision. Massive explosions cascaded through the remaining transport vessels that had somehow survived the initial low-level attacks. Transport Shinaimaru, still struggling to maintain steerage despite extensive damage to her superstructure, took 3 direct hits amidships that detonated her ammunition storage compartments in a thunderous fireball visible from 50 miles away. The shockwave from this catastrophic explosion damaged several nearby vessels and sent towering columns of smoke and debris mushrooming into the tropical sky, instantly vaporizing nearly 800 soldiers who never had a chance to escape. By 9:30, the last transport vessel, Oigawa Maru, listing severely to port with her engine room flooded and most of her crew dead or wounded, presented a pitiful sight as P-38 Lightning fighters made their final strafing run through the debris-choked waters. Her captain had ordered white flags raised in hopes of sparing the 800 wounded soldiers packed into her remaining intact compartments. But Allied pilots continued their attacks with relentless efficiency, understanding that any survivors who reached New Guinea would simply become enemy combatants requiring future military action. The systematic destruction of Japanese fighting capability took precedence over traditional maritime mercy in this total war environment. Destroyer Captain Sato watched helplessly from Asashio's damaged bridge as his last 2 remaining sister ships, Tokitsukaze and Shirayuki, succumbed to concentrated bombing attacks that left them broken and burning on the crystalline surface of the Bismarck Sea. Radio communications had been silent for several minutes, suggesting that Admiral Kimura's flagship had finally been overwhelmed by the devastating aerial assault that had transformed the morning into a nightmare beyond the worst fears of Japanese naval planners. The systematic coordination of the Allied attack, involving multiple aircraft types operating at different altitudes and attack profiles, represented a level of tactical sophistication that Imperial Navy doctrine had never anticipated or prepared to counter. The assumption that well-escorted convoys could safely transit contested waters had been shattered in less time than it took to eat breakfast. Innovation had defeated experience. Desperation had overcome confidence. The ocean, which Japan had controlled for so long, no longer belonged to them. Staff: Sergeant Tommy Lynch, tail gunner aboard Major Gunn's lead B-25 strafer, documented the final moments of destruction through his aircraft's camera system as the last Japanese vessels disappeared beneath the waves in massive explosions of steam and smoke. The innovative skip bombing tactics that had been developed through months of experimentation were proving devastatingly effective against concentrated enemy shipping, validating American tactical theories about low-level attack methods that traditional military doctrine had previously dismissed as too dangerous for practical implementation. The waters around the convoy's final position had become a massive oil slick dotted with life rafts, floating debris, and scattered survivors of what had been 6,900 Imperial Army troops just minutes earlier. Allied fighters continued patrolling the area to ensure no organized rescue efforts could develop, while medium bombers photographed the destruction for intelligence analysis and propaganda purposes back in Australia and the United States. The complete tactical annihilation of such a large enemy force in such a short time frame represented an unprecedented victory for Allied air power doctrine in the Pacific theater. The silence that descended over the Bismarck Sea after the last Allied aircraft disappeared toward the horizon was broken only by the desperate cries of Japanese survivors clinging to wreckage scattered across 20 square miles of oil-slicked water. Chief Petty Officer Nakamura, badly wounded and barely conscious, managed to grab a floating piece of deck planking as he watched the final remnants of destroyer Shirayuki slip beneath the waves with her battle flag still flying in defiant honor. Captain Sato's destroyer, Asashio, trailing black smoke from her damaged engine room and listing dangerously to starboard, represented the sole organized Japanese vessel capable of movement among the sea of cripples. His radio equipment had been destroyed by strafing attacks, leaving him unable to communicate the disaster to naval headquarters. His medical officer reported over 60 casualties among a crew that had numbered 240 men when they departed from Rabaul just 2 days earlier. Around him floated the wreckage of an entire convoy. 8 transports gone, 4 destroyers sinking or sunk, thousands of men dead or dying in tropical waters. The strategic consequences of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory. Japanese High Command was forced to acknowledge that conventional convoy operations had become essentially impossible in Allied-controlled airspace. Future supply runs to isolated garrisons would require fundamentally different approaches, including submarine transport and nighttime small boat operations that could carry only fractions of the personnel and equipment that large convoy operations had previously delivered. The systematic destruction of Kimura's force effectively ended Japanese ability to reinforce their New Guinea positions with significant troop concentrations. General Douglas MacArthur received preliminary reports of the Bismarck Sea victory at his Brisbane headquarters with satisfaction that bordered on elation. He recognized immediately that the tactical innovations demonstrated by his air commanders had fundamentally altered the strategic balance throughout the Southwest Pacific theater. The complete destruction of such a large Japanese force in 15 minutes of coordinated aerial assault validated his controversial decisions to prioritize land-based aviation over traditional naval surface operations, proving that properly equipped and tactically trained bomber squadrons could achieve results previously requiring massive fleet engagements. Major General George Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force, understood that his innovative combat tactics had achieved something approaching tactical perfection in the systematic annihilation of Admiral Kimura's convoy. The revolutionary air combat tactics pioneered during the Bismarck Sea engagement were immediately disseminated throughout Allied air forces, operating in all Pacific theaters with detailed technical manuals and training programs designed to replicate the devastating effectiveness demonstrated by the 5th Air Force and Royal Australian Air Force units. Japanese strategic planning underwent fundamental revisions as High Command acknowledged that conventional convoy operations had become essentially impossible in contested airspace. The complete destruction of 6,000 troops in a single engagement represented a personnel loss equivalent to an entire division, creating strategic gaps in defensive planning that would never be adequately filled, despite desperate attempts to maintain territorial control throughout the Southwest Pacific region. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea had effectively ended Japanese ability to conduct large-scale reinforcement operations. Captain Sato's heavily damaged destroyer, Asashio, limped back toward Rabaul 3 days after the battle, carrying news of a disaster so complete that Japanese naval headquarters initially refused to accept the accuracy of his reports, unable to comprehend how such a large and well-escorted convoy could be entirely eliminated in such a brief engagement. His detailed accounts of Allied tactical innovations, particularly the devastating effectiveness of skip bombing techniques and coordinated multi-altitude attacks, prompted immediate revisions to Japanese convoy procedures and defensive planning that would characterize military operations throughout the remaining years of Pacific warfare. Modern military historians studying the engagement recognize it as a pivotal demonstration of concentrated air power's ability to achieve decisive strategic results through tactical innovation and operational coordination, establishing precedents that would influence naval warfare doctrine through the Cold War period and into contemporary military planning. The 15 minutes that transformed the strategic balance in the Southwest Pacific demonstrated that technological innovation, tactical flexibility, and inter-service cooperation could overcome traditional naval superiority through revolutionary approaches to combat operations. The legacy of Admiral Kimura's destroyed convoy continues to influence military education and strategic thinking in naval forces throughout the world, serving as a definitive example of how tactical evolution can fundamentally alter the course of strategic campaigns. The Bismarck Sea remains a maritime graveyard, holding the remains of thousands of soldiers who never reached their destination. But their sacrifice contributed to tactical innovations that would help end the Pacific War more quickly and save countless additional lives on both sides of the conflict. The wreckage of the convoy settled into deep waters, carrying with it the Imperial Japanese Navy's confidence in conventional surface operations throughout the Southwest Pacific. The battle marked a fundamental shift in strategic thinking that would influence military doctrine for decades beyond the end of World War II. Historical analysis conducted by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey eventually documented that the 15-minute engagement represented the most cost-effective destruction of enemy personnel and equipment achieved by any single air operation during the entire Pacific campaign, validating revolutionary tactical concepts that transformed naval aviation from a supporting role into the dominant force in oceanic warfare. For the men who survived that morning, both Allied pilots and Japanese sailors, the memory would never fade. The sky had become a weapon, the sea, a graveyard, and innovation, married to desperation, had proven capable of rewriting the rules of warfare in the span of a single breakfast. The 8-gun nose B-25 Mitchell, born from grief and perfected in secrecy, had become legend. The destroyer captains who witnessed their convoys dissolve in fire and blood had learned the hardest lesson of war. That confidence without adaptation leads only to death. The morning of March 3rd, 1943, had begun with hope. It ended with 8,000 tons of shipping at the bottom of the Bismarck Sea, 4 destroyers sunk, and the certain knowledge that conventional naval doctrine had died with them. The age of the aircraft had truly begun. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.